everyone.
Good morning, Reverend Barb.
It is officially spring.
Huh?
You're telling yourself that eventually it will come true in June or July.
Yeah.
This morning I want to talk about eternal life, reincarnation. The word reincarnation comes from Latin, meaning entering the flesh again. And the Greek equivalent is more or less transmigration of the soul, which is movement by a person from one place to another. Or some look at it as just to rise up again. We all are basically beings with eternal life and reincarnate many times here on earth, this world, and the real world, which is the spirit world. We're born into this earth with a purpose, a mission, a calling, or an assignment, and each time we're here, it's different. Some people feel that they only live once. This is it. You're born and you live a bit and then you die, and that's kind of sad. It can even cause some suffering when you think, I've only got this time to do this. But as they become fully aware that the present life is only just one point in the eternal flow of time, the never-ending flow of time, and they realize they have lived in the past and will live again in the future. And then they understand that their future lives will depend on their present lives here, and they can choose whatever they want to be in the future. The spirit world is actually the real home of the soul, not here, in the spirit world. The earthly world is kind of like, you can compare it to a foreign school, for an interval time, period of time for spiritual training. So we reincarnate over and over to experience life from different points of views, different outlooks, and develop ourselves into countless numbers of different directions, different paths. We have different journeys every time we reincarnate. The cycle of reincarnation, it varies according to the individual soul. Some say the average is 300 to 400 years, but it depends on the soul, and it can certainly be much sooner or even later. I had my dad in spirit who told me that my daughter's firstborn will be my grandmother, who passed 19 years ago, so I don't think my daughter wants to wait 200 years to have her first child. And when I told my daughter what her grandfather had said, her response was, "Ew, I'm going to give birth to my great-grandmother?" Didn't work out. In 1999, there was a study done by Walter and Waterhouse, and it noted that most people hold their belief in reincarnation quite lightly. They don't really talk about it, and when they do, they're not really clear on what their beliefs are or their ideas. And it's not like you get together for a cup of coffee with your friends and talk about it, so people don't even really talk about it. It's mostly personal experiences, such as past lives or near-death experiences, which kind of influence some people to believe in it. Or just by second-hand accounts, like stories that have been written, or people's accounts of past lives from regression, hypnosis, and dreams. It kind of gives them the feeling, well, there must be something in it if people are experiencing these. Skeptic Carl Sagan asked the Dalai Lama what he would do if a fundamental tenet of his religion, and they believe in reincarnation, but if he was to ultimately disprove reincarnation by science, what would Dalai Lama do? And his answer was, well, if science can disprove reincarnation, Tibetan Buddhism would abandon reincarnation. But it's going to be mighty hard to disprove reincarnation. Sometimes we ask, why do we lose memories of our past lives? You know, when we reincarnate, why don't we remember our past lives, or even why don't we remember our spirit lives? And in most cases, most people don't. After experiencing life on Earth for some time, as we know, the physical body dies, and the soul returns to the spirit world. And when a soul reincarnates on Earth as a human, in most cases, it loses all memories of the real world and memories of its past lives here. And why do we do that? Well, in order to restart again from zilch, from nothing, to acquire a whole new personality, a new beginning, and to start afresh without any interference of past lives or spiritual life. And there's different religions that believe in different kinds of reincarnations, different ways of reincarnating. Spiritualists tend to have different ideas as well, but most do tend to believe in reincarnation in one form or another. Most believe that after life on Earth, the astral counterpart, that's the soul and the spirit, spends some time, which could be a few years or many years, in the astral realms. And when an appropriate time comes, they're incarnated again in an earthly life through being born again into a baby. In other words, after passing from earth life here, the spirit gravitates to the appropriate level in the spirit world, depending on the spirit's spiritual character. And they spend time there adapting and making spiritual progress at the same time, at their own rate. But spiritual progress is universally available at any stage of life, and the chances for more progress to be made means more lives we need to be made. So you need to experience life on the earth here as well as in spirit to progress more. So where do we go to find the most reliable, honest facts to prove the reality of reincarnation? Where would be the best place? Who would be the best people to prove the existence of reincarnation? And we've all heard the saying out of mouths of babes. Children. Children have vivid imaginations, but they seem wise beyond their years, like an old soul. Ever tried to make conversation with Thomas? Sometimes they say things that really make one take notice to the possibility of previous lives. And you wonder, is this a sign of reincarnation, or could it be the child is showing signs of telepathy or other psychic phenomena? There are many stories that show children can sometimes recall memories from another life, especially when they're young. And you can go on the internet and there's a whole slew of stories about children and past lives, but I just picked out a few here that kind of makes you think about it and realize the age. When I get the age, think of the age of this child. So one parent writes, when her son was 3, he told me that he really likes his daddy. He's really nice. My husband is the one and only daddy. So I asked, why is that? My son replied, my old daddy was really mean. He stabbed me in the back and I died. But I really like my new daddy. He'd never do that to me. Another woman writes about when she was a little girl. I lost it when I saw some guy in the grocery store. It was unusual because I generally was quiet and well behaved, but we had to leave the store. When we got to the car, my mom asked what was wrong. I told her he took me away from my first mom and hid me under his floor and made me sleep for a long time until I woke up with my new mom. And that kind of freaked out her mother because obviously She was her biological mother, her first mother, or was she? The father writes about a 2.5-year-old. His 2.5-year-old daughter is taking her out of the bathtub, and he and his wife taught her how you how to be kept clean in certain areas of your body, and those were her private parts. But she just casually replied, "Oh, nobody touches me there. They tried one night. They kicked the door in and tried, but I fought back. I died, but I'm here now." Another mother writes about her son, who from the age of 2 to 6, he would tell her the same story of how he picked her to be his mother. They didn't discuss spirituality or any other religion, but he talked about this man in a suit and picking a mother that would help him accomplish his soul's mission. This is coming from a 2-year-old. He was in a bright room with people, and they were lined up, and he picked her. And the man in the suit asked if he was sure, and he said yes, and then he was born. And then an aunt tells of her nephew, who just started making sentences, so he was just probably around 2. And he told his parents he was so happy he picked them. Then he went on to say before he was a baby that he was also in this bright room with people lined up, and he picked his mom because she had a nice face. That's a good reason. And there's a lot of these stories, but there's some famous stories where the children are young and they talk about this past life like 50 years ago before they were born, and explain it as if they were really there, but it's because they were really there. There's the famous one about a boy who was born in 1998 named James Leninger. And he remembers his past life as a fighter pilot. And this has been on TV and on the internet. And, there's a movie, so a lot of people have probably heard about him. But since he was 2.5, he was always talking about his dreams and memories of a man called Lieutenant James McCready Huston. And he was a World War II fighter pilot who had been killed in Iwo Jima, I hope I pronounced that right, more than 50 years before. He talked a lot about aviation and warplanes, and something he hadn't been taught. Even his parents didn't know anything about warplanes. And he'd have nightmares about being shot down by a Japanese plane with a red sun on it. He'd scream in the night. He'd yell out screaming, "Airplane crash, on fire, can't get out, help." And he told his parents how he'd flown a plane called a Corsair and took off from a boat called the Natoma. How does a 2-year-old get this information? When his mom served him meatloaf for the first time, he replied, "Meatloaf, I haven't had this since I was on the Natoma." So now by then the parents started doing research into this story to see if it was real. And they did discover there had been a small escort carrier called the Natoma Bay, which had been in the Battle of Iwo Jima, and that there indeed had been a pilot called James Huston. His plane had indeed been hit by a Japanese fighter and was struck in the engine, so it was on fire. But that was in March 3rd, 1945. They kept doing research, and they managed to track down this pilot's sister, Anna, who was, at that time, she was 87. And she listened to the boy's story, the young James story, and totally believed him. She said, "He knows too many things." They also tracked down the fighter's cousin, Bob. He was 74 at the time, and he listened to the boy's story and said it was the exact same account that was told to the fighter's parents and his mother way back 50 years ago. There's no way this child could have known that. So in 2004, when young James was 6, His dad took him to a reunion of the veterans who had served on the Natoma. And James was able to recognize one of his old mates after 60 years. He knew who the man was. And his parents stood in awe as young James looked at the men and said, "They're so old." There's a lot more to this story, but you'd have to go on the internet, and I'd be here for another hour. Sometimes we bring phobias in from past lives. We don't understand why we have them. We might have a fear of water or fire, and we don't know why. And it could be from a past life that you've brought forward with you. So there's another story, one more story of a young Swedish girl. Her name was Barbara Carlin. And when Barbara was about 7, 8 years old, she became confused when her school teacher started teaching about Anne Frank. We all know about Anne Frank and Anne Frank's diary, and how she was a young girl who had to live in an attic with her parents for 2 years during the war. And then the Germans found her and her family, and they were sent to a concentration camp. So the teacher was talking about this Anne Frank. And Barbara asked herself, how could she know about Anne Frank? Because that's who I am. She knew her name was Barbara Carlin, but she knew she was Anne Frank. So it was very confusing for her. And she started to realize, well, this Anne Frank person is famous, and how could she be? It's me, I'm not famous. And she just described her confusion as a child as, all this doesn't work for me. Can you imagine how hard it must have been for her to have spontaneous memories of a past life and to have no one to talk to? No one could help her with her confusion or traumatic memories and nightmares. I'm not missing a page. And also going back to her childhood, Barbara had fear of men in uniforms. Up to and including adulthood, she had the fear of policemen. Any man wearing a uniform, she was afraid of them. So to overcome this fear, she trained and became a mounted Swedish police officer. She also disliked eating beans, which Anne Frank's family survived on for 2 years. And she would only take baths, not showers, just baths. As we know, in the concentration camps, the Nazis would bring the prisoners into a large room telling them they were going to have a shower and then pump poison gas to kill the prisoners. So she brought all these things forward into her present life. Her parents didn't know much about Anne Frank either, so they wanted to learn more about her. So when Barbara was 10, she was able to find her way directly to the Anne Frank house, which became a museum, in Amsterdam without directions. She was 10 years old, never been there before, but she knew exactly where to go. And her parents were staying in a hotel, and they wanted to call a taxi because they didn't know how to get there. And she said, no, we can walk there, it's just around the corner. And she took them right there. And these streets of the city were easy to get lost in. Yet her past memories of the streets of Amsterdam were very clear. When they entered the house, Barbara broke out in a cold sweat and felt terror as she had done many times in her dreams. And she entered a room and looked at the walls, and she was excited. She exclaimed, look, the pictures of the film stars are still on the wall. Anne Frank had clipped pictures of movie stars and stuck them on the walls, and Barbara was so excited they were still there. The only thing is the wall was bare. So her parents had to tell her there was nothing on the walls. So they spoke to the tour guide, who explained they had just been temporarily taken down to be mounted in glass so they wouldn't be destroyed or stolen. And then Barbara suddenly felt the need to get out of there. Couldn't stand it, couldn't take it anymore. And as she went down the stairs, her legs felt like jelly, and the tears just ran continuously down her face. And her legs just wouldn't carry her anymore, so when she got to the bottom step, her legs went under and she fell. And there's also a lot more to this story as well, but if you go on the internet and look at Anne Frank's picture and look at a picture of Barbara Carlin when she was that age, identical. They look exactly the same. So like Anne Frank, Barbara Carlin was a childhood writing prodigy. Anne Frank did a lot of writing. As a child, she could not speak to anyone about her past memories, but once she learned to write, she can make conversations on her tablet. At the age of 12, Barbara had her first book, Man on Earth, and it was published and sold as the best-selling poetry book in Sweden. And then from ages 12 to 17, she had 9 more books published. And Frank's greatest wish was to become a journalist and later on a famous writer. So it seems like Anne's desires were fulfilled early in the life of Barbara Carlin. So I'm going to end this by citing one last quotation that Anne Frank wrote in her diary. And it refers mainly to the strength of the Jewish faith in the people, but it also has a poetic ring of truth regarding reincarnation. Perhaps wasn't her intentions, but it's beautiful all the same. So Anne Frank writes, "Who has inflicted this upon us? Who made us Jews different from all other people? Who has allowed us to suffer so terribly till now? It is God who had made us who we are, but it will be God too who will raise us up again." Anne Frank. So thank you, God bless. See you in the future.